The cold, blue light of the chandeliers dripped from the gilded ceiling, pooling on the polished marble floors of the Blackwood Manor ballroom. It was a room built to intimidate, to announce in a hushed, architectural roar the sheer scale of the wealth that had summoned it into existence. In this sea of shimmering designer gowns and razor-sharp tuxedos, Elara was an island of resolute simplicity. Her black and white waitress uniform was neat, pressed, and utterly invisible to the tide of glittering guests she moved through. She was a ghost in the machine of opulence, her purpose solely to replenish glasses of champagne and remove canapé plates, her face a mask of quiet, professional neutrality. Her movements were economical and graceful, a silent dance of service that she had perfected over years of working events just like this one. She didn't mind the invisibility. She preferred it. It allowed her to observe, to see the brittle smiles, and hear the hollow laughter of people who possessed everything but seemed to hold on to nothing. Her hands, though calloused from work, were steady as she navigated the currents of polite, yet ruthless, social maneuvering. Tonight, the current was being dictated by one man, Alistair Vance. He was a titan of industry, a man whose net worth was discussed in the same reverent tones usually reserved for natural wonders. He stood near the enormous, gleaming black grand piano, a magnificent instrument that sat silent and imposing, more a testament to status than an invitation to music. Vance was loud, his voice a confident boom that cut through the polite chatter. He was holding court, a circle of sycophants laughing a little too loudly at his jests. It was then that a careless elbow sent a half-full glass of crimson wine tumbling from Elara's tray. It didn't spill on anyone, merely splashing onto the floor, but the sound was a crack of thunder in the otherwise orchestrated room. Every head turned, and Alistair Vance's sharp, predatory eyes found her. A cruel smirk began to form on his lips. He saw not a person, but an opportunity for entertainment. "Well, well," he boomed, the feigned joviality in his voice barely concealing a thick layer of contempt. "It seems our help is a bit clumsy tonight." A few nervous titters rippled through his circle. Elara immediately knelt, her focus on the small puddle, dabbing at it with the napkins from her tray. She didn't look at him. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction of her fear or embarrassment. "My apologies, sir," she said, her voice low and steady. But Vance was not done. His friend, a man with a vacuous face, gestured to the piano. "It's a shame, Alistair. A beautiful Steinway and not a soul to play it." The words were a spark to Vance's particular brand of cruel inspiration. His smirk widened. He took a step towards Elara, who was now standing again, her composure a silent rebuke to his arrogance. "You know," Vance began, his voice carrying, across the now quiet room, "I have an idea to liven things up." He pointed a manicured finger directly at Elara. "You, waitress, come here." A collective gasp, a rustle of silk and wool filled the room. This was a violation of the unspoken rules. You didn't interact with the staff unless it was to give an order. You certainly didn't make them the center of attention. Elara's heart began to beat a heavy, painful rhythm against her ribs, but her face remained a calm, unreadable mask. She looked at him, her gaze direct, unwavering. Arthur, the seasoned event manager, a kind man with weary eyes, started to move forward. "Mr. Vance, I must insist." "You'll insist on nothing, Arthur," Vance snapped, not taking his eyes off. "Elara, I am paying for this exquisite party, and I desire some entertainment, and I think she will be it." He turned his full, condescending attention back to Elara. "Can you play?" he asked, though it wasn't a question. It was a challenge, a public trap laid with gleeful malice. "I'm sure a woman of your station has many hidden talents." The insult hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Elara's hands clenched into fists at her sides, the knuckles white. She gave a slight shake of her head. "Sir, I am here to work." "Nonsense!" Vance scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "I'll pay you for your time. $100. Play us a song. The offer was the grossest insult of all, reducing a potential art form to a cheap transaction, assuming her talent, if it existed at all, could be bought for a pittance. He was trying to prove a point, that people like her were simple, one-dimensional, and existed only to serve people like him. He wanted to see her fail, to watch her plink out a clumsy, childish tune on an instrument worth more than she would make in a decade. He wanted the room to laugh with him, at her. And as Alara looked at his smug, expectant face, at the sea of curious, judgmental eyes, a fire began to burn behind her own. It was a slow, quiet burn, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a very long time. She would not be his fool. She would not be his spectacle. But she would play, with a quiet dignity that baffled the crowd. She gave a single, sharp nod. The walk to the piano was the longest journey of Ilara's life. With every step of her sensible black-soled shoes on the cold, unforgiving marble, she could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on her back. The air was thick with a palpable, crackling tension, a mixture of pity, morbid curiosity, and cruel anticipation. The whispers followed her like a shadow, venomous and sharp. Can you believe his nerve? That poor girl. This is going to be a disaster. I can't watch. Oh, I can't look away. Alistair Vance had leaned back against a marble column, arms crossed, the very picture of a Roman emperor about to watch a gladiator be fed to the lions. A triumphant predatory gleam was in his eye. He had orchestrated this humiliation perfectly. He had turned a human being into a floor show, and he was savoring every agonizing second of it. Alara focused on the piano, letting the whispers and the stares blur into a meaningless fog at the edge of her perception. The instrument grew larger as she approached, a behemoth of polished ebony and ivory, its surface reflecting the crystal chandeliers like a dark, still lake. It was a world away from the piano of her childhood, an old, scarred upright with yellowed keys and a slightly out-of-tune C-sharp, which her grandmother had played with hands gnarled by arthritis but filled with a love that flowed into every note. That piano had been a refuge, a sanctuary. This one was an arena. She reached the piano bench and paused. She ran a hand, a waitress's hand, a working hand, over the flawless, cool wood. It felt like touching a sacred object. She didn't belong here, not in this dress, not in this role. The world, and everyone in this room, had already decided that. She sat, adjusting the bench not with the flourish of a concert pianist, but with the simple, practical motion of someone setting a tool to its proper height. The silence in the ballroom was now absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of expectation. Every guest was frozen, their champagne flutes held motionless, their conversations dead. This was the moment Vance had been waiting for, the clumsy, fumbling, the awkward silence, the inevitable, embarrassing failure. Alara placed her hands just above the keys, her fingers hovering, not yet touching. She closed her eyes. For a moment, she wasn't in the ballroom. She was back in her grandmother's small, sunlit living room, the air smelling of lemon polish and old books. She could hear her grandmother's voice, a soft, encouraging whisper. Let the music come from the place no one can see, Alara, the part of you they can never touch or buy. Play your truth. She took one slow, deep breath, inhaling the stale, perfumed air of the ballroom, and exhaled the memory of home. The tension in the room stretched to a breaking point. Vance's smirk was so wide it looked painful. He was a breath away from laughing out loud. He caught Arthur's eye and gave a little mocking shrug, as if to say, "Well, I tried." But then Alara's fingers descended, and the silence was not broken. It was transformed. The first note that emerged from the Steinway was not a hesitant plink or a clumsy bang. It was a single, crystalline drop of sound, so pure and clear and filled with such profound sorrow that it seemed to hang in the air for an eternity. It was a note that silenced mockery, a note that demanded attention. A stunned ripple went through the crowd. The smirks on the faces of Vance's friends froze, then vanished, replaced by looks of utter confusion. Vance himself, who had been leaning casually, straightened up as if he'd received a jolt of electricity. His entire posture changed from one of casual cruelty to one of rigid, disbelieving focus. He had been expecting a comedy. He was not prepared for a masterpiece. Because after that single perfect note, Ilara did not stop. A second note joined the first, and then a third, and soon a cascade of music was pouring from her fingertips, a torrent of emotion and technical brilliance that filled every corner of the vast ballroom. She was not playing a simple melody. She was playing Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, a piece known for its ferocious difficulty and its heart-wrenching emotional depth. It was a storm of a piece moving from moments of delicate, heartbreaking tenderness to passages of thundering, furious power. The music was a story. It spoke of struggle, of a quiet soul facing down a loud and brutal world. It raged with righteous anger. It wept with hidden sorrow. And it soared with an indomitable, defiant hope. The transformation in Ilara was absolute. The quiet, invisible waitress was gone, incinerated in the fire of her own talent. In her place sat an artist, a virtuoso, her body swaying in perfect time with the tempest she was unleashing. Her eyes remained closed, her face a canvas of pure, unadulterated emotion. She was no longer in the room, no longer the subject of their scorn. She was inside the music. She was the music. The effect on the audience was seismic. Jaws hung open. Glasses were set down on tables with trembling hands. The silent witnesses were no longer passive. They were captivated, held hostage by the sheer, unexpected power of what they were hearing. People who had come to sneer now stood in rapt, reverent awe. They looked from Ilara's flying fingers to Alistair Vance, and for the first time, the contempt in the room was aimed not at the waitress, but at the billionaire. Vance's face had become a mask of crumbling disbelief. The blood had drained from it, leaving his skin a pasty, sickly white. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air. This was impossible. This couldn't be happening. He had intended to expose her as a fraud, a nobody. Instead, she was exposing him. She was revealing his shallow, ugly soul with every beautiful, complex chord. The music built to its furious, iconic coda, a dizzying, breathtaking rush of notes that sounded like a heartbreaking and a spirit-taking flight all at once. Ilara's hands moved with a speed and precision that seemed superhuman. The piano, once a symbol of Vance's status, was now her voice, her weapon, her vindication. The final thunderous chords shook the very crystal in the chandeliers, and then, as the last note faded into the vast, cavernous space, a new kind of silence fell. It was not the silence of mockery or suspense. It was a sacred, stunned silence, born of witnessing something truly extraordinary, something that defied all explanation and expectation. For a full 10 seconds, the only sound was the collective, held breath of 200 people. Ilara's hands dropped from the keys into her lap. She slowly opened her eyes, as if returning from a great, emotional distance. She blinked, looking, out not at a crowd of judges, but at a sea of stunned, awestruck faces. The spell was broken by a single, explosive sound. It wasn't Alistair Vance. It was Arthur, the event manager, his face wet with tears, clapping his hands together with all his might. His lone applause was the signal that unleashed the flood. The room erupted. It was not polite, genteel clapping. It was a roaring, thunderous, standing ovation. Shouts of "Bravo" and "Encore" echoed off the high ceilings. People who had been strangers moments before were turning to each other, their faces alight with the shared thrill of the moment. "My God," one woman whispered to her husband. "Who is she?" The question was on everyone's lips. All eyes were on Ilara, but she didn't seem to see them. She absorbed the applause not with the triumphant ego of a performer, but with the quiet, humble grace of someone who had simply shared a piece of her soul. She gave a small, almost imperceptible dip of her head in acknowledgement. Then the collective gaze of the room shifted, as if pulled by a magnetic force, toward Alistair Vance. He stood frozen, utterly exposed. The architect of the spectacle had become its sole victim. The laughter he had intended for her was now directed at him, not aloud, but in the pitying, contemptuous stares of his peers. He was a hollow man in an expensive suit, his power and wealth rendered meaningless by a simple waitress and a song. He had tried to crush her spirit, and had only succeeded in revealing the power of his own ignorance. He looked small, pathetic, and utterly defeated. With the applause still thundering, around her Ilara stood up from the piano bench. With a poise that was breathtaking to behold, she turned not to bow to the crowd, but to walk away, as if to resume her duties. But the path back was different now. The sea of guests parted for her, not with disdain, but with a deep, profound respect. The whispers that followed her now were not of mockery, but of wonder. As she neared the edge of the room, Arthur intercepted her, his eyes shining with pride and disbelief. "Ilara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I had no idea." He gestured back at the ballroom, at the world that had just been turned on its head. "You don't belong here, not like this." Ilara looked at the kind, weary man, and a small, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time that night. She looked back at the grand piano, now silent again, a loyal friend who had spoken for her when she had no words. "A person's worth isn't in their job, Arthur," she said, her voice soft but clear as a bell. "It's in what they carry inside." She then turned and walked through the service doors, leaving behind a ballroom forever changed. She left behind the thunderous applause, the stunned faces, and the utterly humiliated billionaire who was now being actively ignored by the very people he sought to impress. Alistair Vance was left alone in the wreckage of his own arrogance, a permanent ghost at a party that would forever be remembered not for his wealth, but for the moment his cruelty accidentally revealed, an astonishing, hidden beauty. Ilara walked out into the cool night air, not as a waitress but as herself, whole and vindicated, the powerful music still echoing in the quiet chambers of her heart.